Hello to everybody. Thanks for being here to watch us in our little fishbowl. As Susanna and I have a hopefully a wonderful conversation, and I'm sure there'll be opportunities for us to open it up and ask a question to the group or have questions come in as well, and maybe a little bit of practice together. But we don't have a plan, we don't have an agenda. We're just going to be in the flow of the moment together. So, Susanna, you're a storyteller. I'm really curious about your story. Like, how did you end up in this role, in this dharma, serving in this way?
Yes. Oh, yes. Okay. Well, I first want to just name for folks, for visual accessibility, I am a light-skinned person of color. I have dark brown hair. I'm wearing a red and black salwar top and sitting in a kind of sunny office space. And I also want to name that I have two puppies who I share the space with, and so you might hear them at some point in our conversation. I also smile a lot, and so whether you can see me, you can probably hear that in my voice, and I definitely attribute that the smile to the practice, because my journey to this point started with suffering. It started with a lot of challenge, and I was born in England to an Indian father and a British mother at a time when those unions usually were not happening. My parents didn't have support. They couldn't find anyone to marry them. It took them over a year to find someone to marry them. And both sides, they're like on my father's side, he didn't tell his family because they would have asked him to come home and made him have an arranged marriage in India. And on my mother's side, many of her family didn't come to the wedding. And so I was born into that context in the late 70s in the UK, in the middle of the UK, which, Robert, you might have some context for this, but this moment in British history, I mean, it's been long, right? There's a lot that led up to this, but there was a lot of racial strife. And so there were fire bombings of Indian and Pakistani families and mixed race families that were happening, with Molotov cocktails being shoved through letterboxes of, families like mine. And so that was the beginning of my life. It was very challenging, and we experienced various forms of discrimination. And my parents thought, well, we need to move somewhere else. We need to get out of this situation. So they moved us to the United States, the land of opportunity, right, and diversity. But they happened to choose, for anyone who knows the Los Angeles area, Chatsworth, which is in the San Fernando Valley, that also is very much, a place filled at the time was filled with a lot of white supremacist movement. And so I grew up fighting. I grew up as a kid who didn't really know who I was or quite how to fit into this like citizen of the world experience that I was embodying, but not gracefully. And so there was a lot of separation. And folks listening, and you too, Robert, like, I feel like many of us, although this is my story, you might have your version or your experience of that. And I was lucky to have practices to turn to, even though I didn't sort of explicitly understand that I was turning to them. I had some meditation and, japa mantra practices, visualization practices that my father, even though he had to really reject his culture to fit in and to survive here in the United States, he still passed those practices on. And then I had the wider Sangha of my extended family who are Bengali and Assamese. That's a region in Northeast India. And I had a lot of support. And so in my early 20s, instead of trying to reject who I was and that part of my culture, and also just seeking to understand, who am I? Where do I come from? Right? These universal questions I think that many of us ask in our lives and on our paths. I turned back towards the practice of yoga and then began a journey of deep practice and then going back to India and practicing and studying. But I'll pause there to just see if there's anything that you want to say.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
Um, I remember talking to somebody about Kripalu, and they said, uh, they were like, why do so many people come to Kripalu, or turn to yoga?
Mm.
And I think for some lucky people, it's because, life uh, feels really safe and comfortable, and doesn't have a lot of challenge. And they've got big questions and they want to kind of expand into those big questions. But
Mm.
for a lot of people, that come to find themselves on a yoga mat or a meditation cushion or some form of practice, it's because of like what you're sharing. It's these life experiences that we're like, this is really hard, and
Mm.
it also feels really unjust. And there have to be answers to this. This world can't be designed for it just to be like that. There have to be answers. And you with your father, that had those practices that he was able to sort of invite you into as well, and something inside of you went yes, like a really strong yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really needed the practices. I remember having a lot of, in college, anxiety attacks and being overwhelmed and going to some, like those wonderful small, I think it was a YMCA yoga class. And I don't even remember the name of the teacher, but the teacher was that kind of teacher that was so welcoming and that wasn't, rushing us from pose to pose or telling us we were doing it wrong. They really gave permission for space to breathe and find ease, and just in child's pose, like crying on the mat, but not tears of sadness. It was more like a homecoming, like,
Yeah.
oh yes, this is the way, there. And it's not a new thing, right? None of us made up yoga. And there's a lot of assurance, I think, that can come from saying we're practicing and we're resting on not just hundreds, but thousands of years of tradition. And yes, we need to be discerning about what we bring forward. There's things in the tradition that aren't supportive to freedom and liberation and, sovereignty now. But there's a path and a practice that has been laid out for us in various systems that we can turn to. So we're
Yeah.
very, very lucky. And part of how I ended up doing what I do is I studied those systems, right? Like many of us here have or are in the process of doing, and then came back to the US because I did a lot of my study. I did some of it here and then some of it in India, and looked around. And first of all, I wasn't able to get jobs. I wasn't getting hired in any of the yoga studios or spaces in Los Angeles. And so there are a lot of yoga studios. They didn't care that I had practiced and studied with swamis that had come out of caves, after
Yeah.
10 years of sadhana. And I thought there's something not matching. And there's a disconnect that's happening with yoga in the West. And so I just started speaking about it. And when I first started, it was sort of like this cry of there's more here and we're missing something from my soul. And then it started to resonate. And so I just
Mhm.
kept speaking, and
Yeah.
that's how I ended up doing what I do.
Yeah. Beautiful. And well, we're very glad you do what you do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about you? What was your call to yoga?
Um, so I grew up in Ireland, and my dad in the 70s, as a small kid, he had big, big, big questions. He couldn't understand the world the way it was. He just said, this makes no sense. And what the priests at the top of the Catholic Church were saying didn't make sense to him. He loved the teachings of Jesus, but couldn't make sense of how it was being sort of filtered down. And then in the 70s, he saw an organization that was teaching, say, off the mat yoga,
Hmm.
the teachings of the Shankara lineage of Advaita Vedanta teachings and philosophy. And he went in there, and the first class, he got introduced to a simple practice of stillness. And he had that, I'm home. He says, I'm never leaving this.
Hmm.
This is home. And he fell in love with it. And then when myself and my three sisters came along, we were just in that. That was, at home. And then himself and his friends were very inspired by this. So they actually set up a K through 12 school to educate children steeped in, the ideas of inseparability, the ideas of wholeness, and the ethos of service and dharma. So I got introduced. I almost didn't have a choice. I had choices when I was a teenager, and later on when quite a few of my friends were like, actually, we're not that interested in this, but there was something about it inside of me that was just an incredibly strong yes. And I think that was connected to just this sort of unapologetic idealism that I've always found inside of me, that people always say, well, you have to be realistic and you have to be practical. And for me, I'm like, that is realistic and practical, but it's just a different way of seeing those things. But that the world can have more peace in it, that the world can have more justice in it, the world can have more love in it. I believe that very, very deeply. And I think I know that the teachings of yoga or any of the wisdom traditions, they all point to those things, and that the more we can make that available to people to practice, not just have it as a lifestyle, but to have it as a way of being, a way of seeing. I believe the world will be a more beautiful experience for many, many more people.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you sharing that. And that's pretty incredible that your father had that call. And also, I want to also normalize for folks listening, now or later, whether you choose to come to the practice from with no exposure, or you practice a different religion. My background is also Shankaracharya and Advaita Vedanta background, and my particular teacher is, and also my family's way of practicing yoga and Vedic practice is very inclusive. And so it's not a religion. I want to kind of underscore it is for some people, right? But yoga also doesn't have to be a religion. And so no one is expected to convert. No one has to practice the same way that their neighbor does, right? There's a radical kind of inclusivity and these universal principles that you're speaking about. But I want to normalize also, since we both come from a kind of steeped background, that it's wonderful to, discover yoga and then start practicing from wherever we are. And my teacher's name is Shankarji. He also laughs at me a lot, and he'll be like, oh, you think you understand? This is just the beginning, right? Wait till your next lifetime or your next lifetime, right? And you don't have to believe in reincarnation either, but just that way of kind of understanding that there's so much depth, and then also that we can be students our whole lives.
Yeah, exactly. Well, what do you feel like you're a student of right now in this moment in January 2024?
Yeah. I'm getting a lot of practice with the niyamas, particularly. So the personal yogic codes, right? In Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, there's the Eightfold Path, and the first is the yamas, like ethical principles with one another, and then the niyamas are kind of, I think of them like inner codes for how to be a yoga practitioner, and particularly Svadhyaya, which is self-study, and Ishvara Pranidhana, which is devotion to the divine. But also I really like the way a colleague of ours, Dr. Shyam Ranganathan, defines this niyama as sovereignty and self-sovereignty. And so for me, I mentioned a little bit of my background. I was really shy. I was socialized, to be quiet and kind of submissive and not speak out of turn. My personality was just quite shy also. But you can probably see now I'm not shy, but I'm still working through some of those blocks to self-sovereignty, right? To truly trusting my own authority, while of course remaining open and interconnected with others, but really not needing affirmation or like to please others, but to truly be full of trust within myself. So
Yeah.
that has been very big for me. How about for you?
I'll answer. I just want to give a reflection back.
Yeah.
The so one of the things that has come online for myself over the last quite a few years now has been the Irish indigenous practices of pre-Celtic sort of shamanic practices, and then the druidic practices that came over with the Celtic Gaels. And one of my teachers, he gave me such a gift around sovereignty. So I was practicing to be to certify as a shamanic healer in this tradition. So I did a particular session, and at the end, I could feel in me, the very young part of me, waiting for his approval, his sort of yes or no. And I wasn't resting in my own authority of actually, do I feel like that was a yes, independent of what he might say? And he said, so what's going on inside right now? And I shared all of that. And then he said, what I want you to do is close your eyes, and I want you to feel the presence of your ancestors, your human, non-human ancestors with you right now. And then I want you to hear what they have to say. And it's been an incredible practice, instead of externalizing with the people that are here, to internalize into the ancestors who don't feel in any way separate from my sense of self. As oh, how was that? Or how am I? And it's been a beautiful, I think it's a stepping stone sort of practice around sovereignty for me, but just going there before going to the authority externally.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing
that. So for me, I've been in a lot of deep prayer all the time, but for the last several months about peace. And I've been praying very, very hard to a spirit to take the war out of me and to make me a man of peace, a person of peace in this world. And as an Irish Celt, there's like wars just in my body. It is so historically there, with ancient past and sort of that tradition of warriorhood, but also with, the last 900 years of colonization in the island, and the very unprocessed trauma of that, that I feel very viscerally in my marrow. So that's been a deep prayer, and that I know that the peace that my heart longs for only actually comes from a surrender, but it's a surrender from a place of sovereignty. That makes sense. Not a place of, it's like a surrender from here rather than just a surrender from being like a piece of seaweed that's detached at the bottom of the ocean and just being pushed around. So those feel like the very real practices that are alive for me right now.
It's really deep. I mean, that's another piece, right, of what for some of us I think brings us to practice again and again, and maybe even for some for the first time, is how can we be of service? And there's been, I feel like, many calls to practice. And one of them for me was in being a part of the anti-war movement in the early 2000s and feeling like I was so angry. And I was attending these peace protests, but I was really furious at the government, at the choices, leaders were making, at the pro-war folks. And I realized that there was I'm showing up creating more anger in the world. And ironically, somehow that week that I had this realization, I happened to be at an organizing meeting for a huge protest in downtown LA. I think there were going to be 100,000 or more people there. And someone nominated me to be the leader of the peacekeeping team. And so I thought that was rather ironic, but okay, and I was also still like, really me, and I went into deep practice. I attended the day before a day-long sit and meditation retreat, and then went and helped hold space for this protest, and felt so aligned and so much different about, like, it was the same action, right? But I was different in doing those actions, being at the protest, holding space. And there ended up being a disagreement that was turning physical between, actually, again, ironically, someone else on the peacekeeping team and a pro-war, antagonist to the protest. And I was able to move in and help diffuse it. And I was the only female-bodied person on that peacekeeping team. And I was the right person at the right time to help diffuse that moment. And I think about these, like, so often for me, the external isn't necessarily changing, but it's a whole different experience inside. And someone might not know whether you or I or, any of us here are doing an action from a place of that inner alignment and peace, or kind of an untethered or reactive place, but we know. And we can take steps through our practice to move closer to that inner alignment. It's not like I'm perfect, right? I mess up all the time, but I just know to try to come back.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, I think that is so often missed in the conversation around service in the world. It's like service in the world is not just about external action. It's action that comes from an internal place. And what is that internal place? That inside out approach to transformation. And they can't just stay on the inside, because that's the privilege in my perspective. That's where the privilege comes in, is like, oh, I'll just do the internal transformation and the rest of the world doesn't matter. Or that's the spiritual bypass piece of, well, this is all an illusion, so it doesn't matter. But when it's truly that the inner transformation has happened, and then that gets expressed out of a deep love of the world, things move. And you go, how is that possible? And you see people have let go of something. They've let go of some pain or some hate, or they've found a place of forgiveness, or whatever it is, and something transforms. And then it gives us these little candles of hope in the world, where you go, look what we're possible of. Look what's possible. Look what we're capable of. Look what we can do when we practice yoga, whether we call it yoga or not.
Yeah. And I think so much is about also, like, having the courageous conversations, right? Like sitting together, even when we disagree. Recently, I was in a circle where there were Palestinian folks and Jewish folks, right? And folks who were neither Palestinian or Jewish. And we were all sitting together, sharing our grief, sharing our desire, sharing our wishes, and trying to figure it out together, what we could do to create more unity rather than separation. And there were, it's not always simple or easy. And I think, I'm curious where you are at personally, but also where Kripalu is, because I've been one of those folks as a South Asian yoga practitioner who's written in, or, our engagement is one where I know I'm part of why I am a visionary is because I'm asking the hard questions in yoga spaces, right? I'm asking, where are the roots of yoga? Why does certain things happen or certain things not happen? What voices are excluded, right? What voices do we need to bring forward more? And it isn't an easy process. We can't tie it up with a bow and say, oh, we're done, right? Like, we're in a context of colonial, post-colonial, and again, you would know this so well from, like you're saying, from your own personal history, but these things are not solved even in a conversation or even in a decade or, even in the life of a institution like Kripalu, but it doesn't mean we can't try. And so I'm curious about what's feeling kind of most on top or connected for you and for Kripalu at this moment of trying to practice in action our service and our dharma.
Yeah. A few things that have really come through that feel really true is that, the problems that it's the Albert Einstein, or the quote that's attributed to Albert Einstein, who knows where it may have come from, but the minds that have created the problems that we're currently facing in the world, whether it's around one of the 30 conflicts that are happening right now as we speak, or what's happening with how we are destroying our home, or whatever it might be, the deep economic injustices that people are experiencing, etc. Our mindset that has created those things doesn't have the consciousness to create the solution to it. And part of my practice is an emptying practice, emptying out, so that even the question of what is Kripalu's role in the world around collective transformation and collective healing, instead of me sitting there going, well, I think this is a good idea. It's like, really, what is this? What is our role? And so as part of how we ask those questions at Kripalu is we go to the land here first that we care for and that cares for us. And it always has something very clear to speak to. And then we try to be in some sort of listening with our lineage as well. Swami Kripalu, and who was always a man of big service in the world through many different sort of roles that he played. And then I personally, as my role as CEO, I sort of at times hold some of these questions, first, and then we bring them out to many other folks to be in listening with. So as part of my own practice as CEO, I went down to the Deep South during Thanksgiving week to walk the Selma Bridge and to be in Alabama, and just to be immersed in what, even more of an understanding of what they were doing at that time, but then also to see the Equal Justice Initiative Museum from enslavement to incarceration, and see the unbelievable amount of work that's still to be done, right? And to be in those waters and that energy. And then over the winter holiday, I was back home in beloved Ireland, and I went to Belfast in the north of Ireland and dragged my poor mother on these things. But we went into Belfast, and we went between the different communities, which have now this incredible peace at a political level, but at a community level, this huge segregation. We have in Belfast, there's peace walls and 40-foot high structures between neighborhoods, so that people can't throw missiles over the walls. But there's a form of peace, and you look at it and go, it's incredible that we got there. But to your point is like, okay, and now what's next? So this has all been part of my sort of prayer and ceremony around this. And what is emerging very, very clearly is that Kripalu has, for its 50 years, has been a place and a space where people can come and be together. And that's a beautiful thing for the world. And it's something that we have very intentionally tried to hold on to, because especially in the United States, I feel like there's very few sort of spaces where people can come together with different political views or opinions, etc., and just be together in community. And that's like what I'll say is a passive support for the world, is just being that space. But I've been in conversations for the last 2 months now with people and saying, what if Kripalu was to also be a place that where people could come for one, to build capacity around dialogue again, an art that we have lost in our westernized world. We know how to argue with each other. We know how to tell everybody that we think that their idea and opinion is the worst idea and opinion in the world. But we've lost this ability to sit and listen to difference and to not hold that difference as an assault on myself, but to so how do we create space for people to come and build their capacity so they can bring that capacity back out into their communities, to hold more dialogues in community? And then so that's one piece that's emerging that we're going to move forward with. And then the second piece that's emerging is, how do we bring then groups who are holding difference to Kripalu, and through partnerships with other organizations, help them have facilitated dialogues where they can then do the reconciliation work and the repair work that needs to happen, and then form new agreements about how they want to be in community together. So I was talking with folks in the Boston City area around building this capacity for teachers that are really struggling in the classrooms right now around how to hold these conversations about what's happening in the world. But then also folks who are doing other work in another part of Massachusetts with a police precinct and a BIPOC community that have been in real conflict for about 20 or 30 years. And they're trying to do some institutional work right now. And we said, when you're ready, well, let's look to bring those two groups, representatives from those two groups together to see if they can go through that healing process in a place that's designed to help people heal. So this feels like, and I keep coming back to this, like, what is our dharma? Not just what does the world need? There's so many needs in the world, but what's that merging of our dharma and the world's needs? This feels like what's really arising. And there's many people doing this work in the world, which is fantastic. And the idea of trying to help also pull some of those groups together so we can build, there's so much money going into separation. We may not find all the money to go into togetherness, but we can build power, soul power into togetherness. And that feels right, and it feels exciting.
Yes, that does. It feels very exciting. And, many of the great teachers, and I think Swami Kripalu is one of them, had that mission of service, yoga in action. It's not just, yes, we can care for ourselves, and goodness knows I've experienced many personal boons from the practice, but, and there's also this engagement, this call to engage in the ways that are right for us and that are that we're trained to do. I was fortunate enough to be in Plum Village with Thich Nhat Hanh, who's another of my mentors and teachers, and I'm ordained in his tradition as well. And he had brought together a group of Palestinian and a group of Jewish folks. This was in 2004, so a long time ago, but as many of us might know, the conflict, it's not new. It's been going on since, what was it, 48, right? Like it's a historical conflict at this point. And it was quite simple, the practices that he would bring to bear, but the reason they were so effective, and they were really effective, I was part of the kind of Dharma group that was with the Jewish and Palestinian folks, because you wanted some practitioners who were able to hold the practice. It's very simple. It's like the 5 yamas, right? But they're kind of written in a more Buddhist context. And the one that we really practiced was, in a Buddhist context, right speech, and in a yogic context is satya, which is like deep listening, truthful speech, and also listening in such a way that what is unsaid or even unspeakable has a space to be heard. And that practice, that couple weeks, was incredibly transformative, not just for the folks in that circle, but as they went back, and into their communities. And so these are moments that I think you're so right. Like they're moments in time, but they're incredibly powerful. And they are a way of honoring the lineage, and speaking to that and bringing that forward in a very timely way.
Yeah. Yeah. And every moment of big transformation that I've studied, the ending of apartheid in South Africa, or the peace process in the north of Ireland, or the work of civil rights in the United States, in the women's movement to end the conflict in Liberia, these big examples. Listening was one of the core medicines and tools of transformation. There was like a holy demand for listening that happened at some point. And grace facilitated that to happen in some way, that something emerged from it. People went, oh, wait, I just heard something new, and that allowed me to see you for the first time without the veils. And I saw and loved your humanity. And they talk about these stories, the IRA, the head of the IRA in Derry, and the head of the British spy agency would meet for 25 years behind the scenes. I happened to, the person who used to invite them into his home was my friend, and we would meet for 25 years to do this secretly in his living room. And they connected over making each other cups of tea, and finding out that both of their sons loved to play the same sports, and that they would then argue about whether they liked Yeats or Wilde's poetry better. And the more we can help people to soften through the practices of yoga and meditation, etc., to back into our humanity, so that we have that remembering ourselves, like you said, of in child's pose on the mat. Oh, this is truth. This is beauty. Then we unlock this unknown potential within us as a human species to do remarkable things together.
Yes, I know we're going to close soon, and so I want to make sure to ask, because it's such a precious thing to have a lineage that is, with Swami Kripalu and come with teacher from India, right? And who is steeped in a tradition. And I know lineages are also fraught, right? And we've talked before, and I'm sure you've talked with other folks about needing to question our gurus and not accept unquestioningly, or allow, when there's transgressions or abuses of power, to make sure that we do what we can. That's part of Satya too, to not create cultures where secrets are hidden, but where it's a culture of healing. But what I'm curious about is how we bring those roots, like the roots of yoga and the cultural elements, and you kind of alluded to like the racialized context that we're in the United States, how we bring the heart and the roots of yoga back, both in the practices we're talking about, but also really explicitly, like centering South Asian voices, South Asian teachers. Because I will say, of course, nowhere is perfect, but I think you're the only retreat center who's invited, say, me, and then multiple other South Asian teachers, right? Which I'm not trying to say pat Kripalu on the back, right? Like, I think that's what everyone should be doing. But it's not happening in a widespread way. And so obviously Kripalu you can speak for what you all are doing. So I'm curious about that. How are you centering the culture, the tradition, the practitioners that yoga comes from?
Yeah, there's like a 5-hour conversation in that answer for sure. And I appreciate you saying kind things about the work that we've been doing. And we haven't done enough in our 50-year history at all to do that. And we have a lot more work to be in integrity as an institution of our size that is helping to bring this beautiful, beautiful work into the world. To stay in integrity, we have to continue to lean into that conversation with some real investment, and we will. And we decided that instead of being, a leader in the field, that's we're trying to make other places jealous, so they are forced to copy what we're doing in these good ways. So we're working actively behind the scenes to talk to people about what we're doing, other centers about what we're doing. And then we're saying, and this is how we did it. You can copy everything if that works in your setting. So that this is not a one-off at Kripalu, that it's sustained at Kripalu and is not just happening at Kripalu, but is happening in many other places in a way where, hopefully in several years, the question isn't how do we get this happening in other places? It's already happening in other places. And the question is just, how do we continue to sustain this? And it never happens fast enough. And I'm saying that from a white body. I can't imagine how that feels from somebody with your beautiful cultural lineage.
Yeah, it's a process. And I think that's a choice we make, to be in relationship and to continue to be in relationship and to ask the challenging questions and mess up and, keep going. So, we will continue.
And Swami Kripalu is such an integral part of what we do. His spirit, his teachings, his message, his life as an example. And there are lots of rich lessons from Kripalu's institutional history to be learning from, to be questioning, to be challenging, to not be repeating. And so we're an organization that's, had some real rough patches around the guru relationship with Amrit Desai, and him being asked to leave the community by the community in the mid-90s for his abuses of power. And the organization did a really beautiful job knowing with the tools that were available to it at that time. But, the integrity piece is something that is a daily practice for us as an institution. Not just to make sure that we are limiting the harm that's happening in our institution or anything like that, but also to ensure that we're in alignment with our Dharma, that we are practicing, not just teaching. And there's such a danger that you can run an institution that teaches, but not be practicing. And we won't have we call it yoga capital here. We won't be refilling the yoga capital balance if we're not practicing as an organization. And if that happens, then, the flower will wilt and dry, and there won't be the perfume. People won't be transformed and healed by their experiences. And that's not what the world needs.
Right. And I think what you're speaking to is there's a way of practicing that may look messy, and it may look like having conversations around transparency and, raising kind of Me Too type of conversations and space for that and space for survivors. And, it's ongoing, especially even though something happened 30 years ago, there can still be ripples today. And so one of the things I've learned in the work that I do is to hold that space for changing. It's really like culture shift, changing culture takes applying particularly yamas and yamas across the board again and again and again. And in ways that, like you're saying, when you're leading an organization, you may not realize still needs to happen. And so being open as a teacher and as a student to that recommitment. For me, it's about no matter how far away we've gone or how much we stopped practicing or forgotten, we can come right back and be right there in integrity and at the heart of the practice.
Right. Yeah. And just like you said a little while back, there's no arriving, like your teacher said. Just wait till next go round
Yeah.
and what you'll learn and expand into. Just a constant, as long as we're in our practice, then things are constantly evolving, deepening, expanding, changing. And that's also the beauty of this. This path is that, man, it's never boring.
No.
Yeah. Well, I know we are over our time, so we should honor everybody else and honor your time as well. Just a real pleasure to dive into some of this stuff with you, and hopefully we get to do it again at some time later in the year.
Yes. Thank you so much to you, to everyone here. Much appreciation.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. There's some links in the chat for any upcoming programs. So please click through and have a look to see what's available. And just wishing everybody a really restful evening, and continue to be slow in January. Winter is slow. The rest of the animals are slow. Let's stay in that rhythm together. Thanks for being here.